This is one of a number of URF webinars that we're hosting around the world in different time zones. This is our first down in a more respectable time zone for sort of Australia and New Zealand and the region, which is great. And delighted to have some global perspectives and also some local national perspectives on today's call. So I've just got a couple of notes that I wanted to sort of touch on for those new to the URF here in Australia. Non-profit member-based organisation founded in 2021, headquartered up in Toronto, where Lee is right now. And for a number of years, we've been bringing together stakeholders to really engage in dialogue, provide guidance around particularly our focus of public area mobile robots, which also includes robotaxis, entering into our public places, both indoor and outdoor. We've been a lead on the ISO 4448 standard that's been developed around PMR behaviour in public places, and that work continues. And our membership is quite diverse. It covers technologists, robotics companies, city councils around the world, advocates, and a lot of universities as well. And our team has boots on the ground in a number of places. I've listed a few of them there on the screen. Some of the things that we do, it's a full contact sport, urban robotics, and putting autonomous things out into the public realm, and providing some clarity and some guidance is a key part of what we do. And our executive guide and a number of our other resources are on our website, urbanroboticsfoundation.org, if you're certainly keen to dive in a little bit deeper. There's a lot of words on the slide that I have in front of you at the moment, but really what I wanted to highlight was that whilst sort of food delivery is certainly a key topical part of the PMR conversation right now, there's actually a lot of use cases that we're seeing around the world. And so I want to remind us to make sure that we sort of keep a broad purview on those use cases and the different ways in which PMRs can support our city operations. And just finally, in terms of guidance, we recently, in collaboration with ASTM, Mass Robotics, and NIST, we published this white paper, which really focused in on governance around PMRs coming into shared public places. So definitely encourage you if you wanted to dive deeper. That's quite a comprehensive guide that's now on our website. And of course, if that's not enough, our next webinar a bit later in June, not optimal for an Australian time zone, but for the early birds or the late night owls, about 1 a.m. in the morning, we'll be diving deeper and certainly touching on that white paper that I just referred to. But let's move into today's session. I'm delighted to have Yariel Diaz from Serve Robotics with us. Yariel is going to be giving a presentation shortly. Dr. Damith Herath from University of Canberra is with us, and also Ben Foster as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to hear from Yariel first, who's going to give a presentation around experience around deployments in the world, really give us a look into sort of what's been happening on the ground, so to speak, and in the street. And then I'll invite Damith and Ben to join us on a bit of a discussion panel. But with that, Yariel, we'll fade off into the distance, and the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, folks, for making the time today. So by way of introduction, my name is Yariel Diaz. I'm the Director of Government Affairs at Serve Robotics. I cover government affairs mostly for the US with the assistance of our whole policy team, including our wonderful team that oversees California, and my colleague Vig Nashram, who is over our team overall and takes care of our markets in Canada and international expansion. So I'd like to kick in just briefly talking about the overall market and where we are. There is a very, 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 very long list of delivery robot companies and just regular PMRs throughout the world. I figured I would focus the presentation, since I'm approaching this from a delivery side, by highlighting the largest players in the space in the delivery robot company side, specifically in the US. We have, oh, and I'm based in Dallas, Texas. I didn't mention that. We have obviously us, Serve Robotics. We're the largest robot operators in the United States with over 2,000 robots. In the center there, right next to us, you have AV Ride, and they are across multiple markets here in the US. Top right is Starship. They're also across multiple markets, mostly university campuses in the US and also abroad in Europe. DoorDash recently announced Dot, which is the bottom left, and they are exploring new markets, and that's through DoorDash Labs. And the center is KiwiBot. They're the smallest of our brothers and sisters in the robot delivery space. And then bottom right is Coco. And Coco is also operating in some of the same markets we are, while they continue to expand their footprint. So going a little further into Serve and what we do, we are a robot delivery company that is seen as an option for safe, reliable, and green deliveries. I stress the fact that it's an option because nowhere in anywhere that we operate right now is this a mandatory way of receiving a delivery. The problem that we were trying to solve for when we began working on this project was how do we solve for the fact that we are moving a 1 kilo burrito in a 2-ton car? That may sound funny, but that's a reality around multiple cities in the world where you have deliveries happening with a vehicle of a very small parcel and oftentimes an e-cargo bike or a scooter. And we are much slower than all of those, which inevitably also means that we could contribute a smaller impact to CO2 emissions. We are going in a much shorter distance. We are considerably safer, and just in comparison to cars and combustion engines, we are a little easier to manage on city levels. We have over 2,000 bots. I mentioned that across the US. We're across 7 major markets, and I'll show them later on in the presentation. We have over 4,500 partners, and we continue to grow. We operate through Uber Eats and DoorDash, as well as have direct relationships with some of the partners that you see on the screen. The other problem that we were trying to solve for is the fact that when we were within Postmates, because that's where Serve got its founding, we were solving for a problem that delivery drivers within that last 2.5 kilometers did not want to pick up orders, mostly due to the fact that they don't pay a lot. Delivery drivers make most of their money based on distance, and the last 2.5 kilometers usually either doesn't pay a lot. And in the US, there's a tipping culture, and that's based on a percentage of the overall order, and they also don't make a lot on those tips. Also, when you think about the experience of delivery using a car in crowded streets and downtown urban centers, usually that leads to double parked cars, not a lot of space to legally park, and just short trips equaling those tiny tips. How we think that this can be reimagined is using our delivery bots and obviously some of our partners as well in sharing the sidewalk, removing those cars from the road, allowing much slower, safer bots to operate on the footpaths. And that means also cleaner air. When we're talking about the emissions, even when compared to electric vehicles, our footprint is considerably smaller, mostly to do with the fact that we're going slower speeds. We are a much less heavy device, about 100 kilos is what our bot weighs. And we're also operating with 2 lithium-ion batteries, so the battery sizes are also considerably smaller. When I mentioned I'd note the cities that we're in, this is a full list of the cities that we are currently operating in based on what has been publicly reported from our operations as of the end of last year. Our last market to launch was Alexandria, Virginia, and Chicago, which happened at the end of last year. And looking at what the footprint looks like as of our last earnings call, we announced our future markets based on where we intend to be and at what we're working towards, which includes the markets that you see on your screen. And as you can see for Australia, there are several on this list. What that means is that we have already began to have conversations across most of these markets in order to engage with municipalities on what the regulatory schemes can look like. Oftentimes, when we enter a new market, we are either the first mover in the delivery space for robots or the second mover, but it's still the first mover is in a pilot or a proof of concept stage. So we have to engage with folks locally to see what the appetite is for our service. We have to engage with our delivery partners to see what their appetite is and where they want us to focus on. We mostly focus on urban areas and dense, very dense centers because that's where the majority of the delivery volume tends to be. And that's also what guides the cities that you see here on this list. So part of what we do beyond just deliver our deliveries across multiple markets is collect data around city infrastructure. When we began our pilot and proof of concept in West Hollywood, which has now been codified after 2 years of operating, we began to provide information to the city of West Hollywood around our activity to give them heat maps of where the robots were going to and from, where they were picking up and where they were dropping off, as well as pram ramps that were missing. We call them curb cuts in the US, to help to improve accessibility issues and identify areas that maybe the city wasn't aware of, collecting data and giving it over to the cities for free as a means of providing value with our operations in our markets. Inclusive design to us also looks at creating that feedback loop and receiving input not just from our cities, but also from seniors and the disability community. We really think of our cities as partners, and we want them to give us that truth on the sidewalk, just like we expect folks to reach out to us and let us know with their concerns. And let me tell you, they do, which is wonderful. We want to make sure that we are hearing from our public. And we also inform standards, developing through partnerships like this one with the Urban Robotics Foundation. Although our partners are mainly our food delivery partners, meaning Uber Eats and DoorDash and some others that are in the works, we also serve restaurants. The restaurant business is a very tough one. Delivery is a very difficult option for restaurants, especially that short distance within that 2.5 kilometer, which is the one that we deliver. So we're helping those restaurants to fill in those gaps. Restaurants often prefer using our service, mostly because it is a secure delivery method, meaning from the moment it gets put into the bin to the moment it arrives at the customer, the food is the same as it left the restaurant. No one has eaten your chips or drank your drink. It provides a more reliable service from the point at which we accept the order to we complete it. We have a 99.8% completion rate. And because we are not taking up parking spots, we're giving small businesses the ability to continue to use those spots for their own. So I wanted to show this graph because it shows the journey, the delivery journey that we have across the delivery experience. So 0 is actually creating the regulatory scheme for us to be able to operate. We create this scheme with our local governments, with our state governments or federal, depending on the situation. In most of the states in the United States, there are over 20 states that already have authorizing legislation at the state level. Some require additional regulations at the city, some don't. And then there are other states that we're operating in that we have to go city by city by city to create our regulations, as is the case in the LA County area. So that's really step 0. We're doing the same in Australia. There is no statewide or local regulation that speaks directly to what we're doing. So in most cases, it is a case of first impression, which is in contrast to the UK as an example, which has proof of concepts and other regulations already in place, memorandums of understanding and such, with some of our competitors that are already operating in some of these cities. So once we have that regulatory agreement to operate, we begin to operate on the apps. A restaurant can opt in or opt out to being on our platform. Usually most opt in and choose to stay in the program because of all the benefits that we discussed. And lastly, the customer can choose to opt in or opt out. So what would happen is if a customer, so that's number 4, is placing an order for a delivery from a restaurant that has opted in and is within 2.5 kilometers of that home, the person will receive a message that says, there is a robot in your area. Would you like to receive a robot delivery? If they hit yes, and they had prepaid a tip, in the case of the US, that tip gets refunded to you and you're saving whatever percentage you tipped. Regardless of the tip, if you say yes, a robot will do your order. So the delivery will get pinged to a robot that's nearby. That robot will go to the restaurant to pick up the order, station outside of that restaurant quietly, and then proceed to go do the delivery. And although this graph may look a little funny because that person is only 2 blocks away, most of our orders are actually that short of a distance. So then the order arrives at the customer's home, they unlock it using a code or their app, and then the delivery goes to the next high traffic area, the robot, I'm sorry, in order to do its next order. So with this, I also want to make sure that we talk about jobs, because that's a question that always comes up when we're having conversation around robots. Serve, just like all of our partners, needs people. We need people. We need people like me to have conversations like this. We need people that manage our facilities. We need people that work on our marketing and comms and remote supervisors. We need folks that work in the field directly with these robots. And that's what's being called now new collar jobs, field operations, field agents, mechanics, managers, folks working out of our spaces where these robots are housed, because they need to be cleaned, they need to be serviced, they need to be maintained, they need to be fixed, they need to have software updated. So these are very well-paying jobs that start considerably above most minimum wages in every market we're in. And it provides an opportunity for folks to be upskilled into in-demand robotics roles that most folks don't have, because most of the folks that are working for us in these spaces have never worked for a robotics company before, but they have some sort of similar skill, whether it's a mechanic or they've worked on scooters or something else. They come in, we give them that training as part of their onboarding, and then they continue to grow from within the company. We also work with our communities to make sure that folks understand who we are, what we're doing, what our values are. And the next two slides are some examples of that, whether it is gay pride events or senior events, working with specific groups in their parades, working with the unhoused community, community cleanup events. And the event on the right-hand side was an event we did during Christmas, taking toys to a children's hospital in Chicago. So Australia. And this is something I created with ChatGPT. So mind you, it is not 100% accurate, but I found it to be very fun and I wanted to include it here in the presentation. These are the cities that we are actively talking to right now. And Ben is on the call and he'll talk a little bit about Gold Coast and some of the conversations there. But none of these cities currently have a program that exists for personal delivery devices or delivery robots or PMRs. So we are having to engage in those conversations right now so that we can build out whether it's a new regulatory path, identify an existing regulatory path that we can fall under based on the current schemes that might make sense, and in tandem, work with the state governments and federal governments to work on improving some of these operations throughout. Our robot looks like this. This is a very good example of what the tech looks like. It works at level 4, so it has LiDAR, it has radar, like sensors at the front. It has cameras. It can fit up to 4 large pizzas in the 57-liter cargo bin. It can go at top speed of 18 kilometers per hour, although we're usually going at about 6 to 8 or 4 to 6, depending on the width of the sidewalks. There is a touchscreen that can be used to put in your code to unlock the bin. The batteries, as I mentioned, are lithium ion, and they are all-day batteries, can last about 14 to 16 hours. So that is a quick review of the bot. There are cameras all around. So there's 2 in the front, 1 on each side, 1 in the back, 1 up top. The 2 in the front is because one of them is a telescopic camera that looks across the crosswalk to see if it's time to cross or not. So that's us in a nutshell. I want to make sure that I come back to this because this is what I'm spending a lot of time on lately. It's a conversation on Australia. I'm happy to answer questions more in depth here, and I will just stop sharing my screen unless you want me to keep this up, Adam, and then I'll let folks jump in.
Thanks, Yariel. Yeah, feel free to leave that up for a bit. I'd like to bring Damith and Ben in for a moment if both of you want to switch your camera on. And again, Yariel, thanks for that. Thanks for that presentation. It's sometimes a little bit difficult on PowerPoint to grasp the concept and how it works and what it might feel like in place. And I had the benefit of being in West Hollywood for a week back in January, just trying to get my head around what these are and what they do. And both daytime and nighttime, I certainly spent a lot of time down on that sort of main thoroughfare in West Hollywood, where not only Serve Robotics but Coco as well was sort of zooming about. And for me, even though I'd been sort of tracking the PMR dialogue and idea for quite some time, it's not until you sort of get into place with them in real life that it becomes real. And Damith, I wanted to sort of throw a question at you first. I just want to sort of have a quick chat with you and Ben, and then we'll sort of circle back, all 3 of us, for a conversation. And indeed, for our guests, please make sure you contribute as well, and the chat box is there. But Damith, when you hear from Yariel just now, you sort of see some of the work that's going on across the US. This must start to get a bit real for you in Australia. Can you sort of share some opening thoughts and reactions to sort of what Yariel has just presented, and where that intersects with your research around robots in public places. I mean, is this a key milestone in your career that this may sort of start to make its way to Australia? What are your first reactions about what you see and hear there?
Thanks, Adam. Good to be here. We did a workshop about a decade ago called Misbehaving Machines. And I do kind of work in the intersection of robotics, art, and psychology, and try to understand robots in different human contexts. So I never thought, 10 years ago, if you asked me that this would be real in a decade's time, uh, that wasn't a thing that we were thinking. I find it's exciting. I mean, I always said that, robotics, I mean, it has to be in the public interest and in sort of public domain. One of the things I think we probably in Australia that we do not necessarily, I think, are the first movers in terms of adopting robots in these kinds of contexts. Um, we did a study around the same time that we did these misbehaving machines. I'll get back to that again. What makes people adopt robots in sort of more in general sense? And what we found out that, of course, there's interest. There's a large portion of, I think, Australians are actually keen to see robots in these kinds of settings. But there's also a bit of an apprehension and concerns. And I think, yeah, Yariel, you kind of address some of these in a context like job security, and also the sort of probably a conversation around dehumanizing and disconnecting people and things like that. One of the things I think one of the key insight we had back from those initial research, I think people want to see them as providing a service and a utility. And I think that's what a lot of the PMR is actually doing. If you look at the numbers and what we sort of articulating Ariel earlier, I think they do solve a problem. And that's kind of the important thing. The key question, I think, especially in the Australian context as well, is how do they sort of manifest in that sort of public space? And it's going to be a nuisance. And this is kind of what the question around the misbehaving machines came about, because we were interacting with some of these robots and actually in a very public setting uh, as a performing art piece once, and one of the robots lost internet connection. And this massive robot, it was actually kind of just driving straight to the participants, the audience, and nobody knew what was going on. And that's like that was part of the actual performance. So everybody's just standing still, and this thing's just going to drive through you and plow through you. And on the top of the robot, it says, "This robot can kill." So we had to kind of intervene and actually drag the back. This is one of those huge Segway platforms. Pull it back, right? So I think people have concerns around that, like how these things, sort of interact. What if something goes wrong? Uh, so that's part of the question. The other part, I think, is how do we actually navigate in human space? I'm sure that you have looked into some of the social norms and things like that. I mean, Australians have some particular notions around how we navigate in the public space. Um, so one of the research questions that we are asking now is what we call the reciprocal dance problem. So this is just an example, right? So when you have two people sort of in a narrow corridor, how do we navigate that space, right? And the first sort of principle is that in Australia we usually kind of tend to walk on the left side. So you give your way to the left. But if it's relatively narrow, then you need to kind of do this little dance to work out who goes which side. So that sort of thing when manifest in a robotic system, how do you do that? I know that the Serve robots have little eyes. I think it kind of indicates some of that intent, but probably not all of it. So as a starting point, I think there's a lot of social norms and peculiarities that sort of localized to particular geographic areas, and how do you kind of integrate those kinds of questions into these robotic systems is one question. The second one is, I think, how do we alleviate the concerns around safety, security, and also privacy concerns that we have about robots? So I think they're kind of like two sort of anchoring points that I think people have, especially in Australian conversations.
Yeah. Damith, thanks for those observations. We'll sort of come back and dive a little bit deeper into those. Ben, Gold Coast was listed up there on the map. There was a dot. You saw the graphic. How does that make you feel as a sort of a representative of the city when it comes to economic development, investment attraction? Gold Coast certainly has a brand, and it has a history of investment in not only infrastructure but innovation and smart cities and things like that. Is this a natural extension possibly to what you've been doing for quite some time, or something more deliberate? What would you share as sort of an opening comment here?
Yeah, thanks. And again, I'll share in the others in thanks for being here and welcome to everybody. But from our perspective, I think it's really channeling the core, what we're starting to adopt as a real identity on the Gold Coast, which is a city that says yes. Where when you think about it in an Australian context, we're really the only significant postmodern city in the country, right? When you think about it, we were only gazetted as a city in about 1954. We've seen our economy double in size in the last 20 years. We're approaching 700,000 people. Will be 1 million in the next decade, and so it's really coming at this concept of innovation and this concept of accepting and welcoming new technologies from two fronts. It's both a want and a need. So a want in that we have a over-index of entrepreneurs and innovators who gravitate here because of all the lifestyle reasons. So similar to you see in other markets around the world where lifestyle destinations have captured those who are wanting to make a difference and do so. And so we're certainly seeing that, and post COVID have the growth of that has been exponential. And so you have this, and Damith was sort of talking about this. There's almost a social acceptance of innovation that we're seeing more and more as a common occurrence up and down the city. But there's also, as I said, because of that rapid growth and because of that growth of innovation, there's also the need aspect of it. As we're a very linear city. The Gold Coast is essentially 60 kilometres of a very thin strip bordered by the ocean on one side, as you can see in the background behind me, and then we've got a hinterland of mountains not far behind that. And so it's a very linear city, highly dense, urban areas and population. And what we're seeing is that throughout that rapid growth, because we were built on tourism as our sort of birth and historic places, that a lot of the retail, commerce, hospitality is centrally located in those tourism hotspots. And a lot of the people that are relocating to the Gold Coast and that great population growth aren't actually living in those centralised tourism destinations. And so what that means is that this is solving a problem for us in one sense, in terms of the workers that you're requiring to be in those locations and access the locations to service that tourist population that ebbs and flows during peak seasons. We see this as a way to bring people back into those urban areas. I mean, we saw it. I referenced the pandemic earlier. That was one of the problems, is that we couldn't get the workers in the hotels who lived maybe outside the city, and now because of traffic concerns, it's maybe a 40-minute commute to get into the middle of Surfers Paradise or Broadbeach or some of our centralised suburbs. They were having trouble getting those workers to come in, and those hotel rooms were still full. People were still travelling, and finding a way to service those. And so innovation like this and those adjacent to it is certainly something that I think we want. As I said, we want on two fronts. We want it, and we want to accept that, and we want to be the city that says yes. And while we're happy to be, and we don't expect to be the only Australian city to adopt this, we definitely, I think we're on record as wanting to be the first to bring this online in a meaningful sense. And so there's definitely a desire to be leading the pack in that front and accepting of that. there's also the need. There's a very real need for this in terms of servicing what is a highly dense population in the worker economy that's there. So we see it as a win-win from that perspective, and both, whether it's Serve or other robotic functions across the city, we're looking at ways that we can adapt as quickly as possible and try and keep up with other markets and jurisdictions around the world.
Yeah, Ben, thanks for that. I wanted to come back to you, Ben, but also the questions for you as well, Yariel. Part of me says that we've been here before with e-scooters and e-bikes. Not exactly the same, because these are robots sort of with, not their own minds, but they're doing their own thing. But that journey of, deployment, pilot, angst, wins, losses, it gets messy, and whatever happens. So I feel like, A, we've been here before, but B, because we've been here before, one would hope that this journey with PMRs is potentially going to be, I don't want to jinx us, but we've learned from other technology deployment in the public realm. Ben, you've got sort of shared, e-mobility on the Gold Coast. Yariel, maybe start with you. Would love to know about any observations you've had about your deployments in cities that have sort of previously gone there, whether it be with e-scooters or sort of other, technology and e-mobility. Are there any sort of correlations there, or it's just random? What would you share?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I can use West Hollywood as the example. When we began engaging with the city of West Hollywood, the city had just banned electric scooters. So they had literally said, not interested. We don't want them here. We don't want them on our sidewalks. We don't want them on our streets. So it was a very difficult time to get that approved. It took a little over a year, which is a bit of long time for the US. For context, we've only been engaging in Australia since the end of last year, beginning of this year, and we're pretty far along, as Ben said, thanks very much to his help in the Gold Coast. So thank you, Ben. But also because of that, the city took its time and its learnings from the scooter world and then applied that to our pilot and to our proof of concept, and specifically limiting the fleet size or working to increase the fleet size at a certain scale in a staggered way, working on hours of operations that met our demands, but were still within what the city was able to, identifying corridors that made sense and some that did not, just because the sidewalks were too narrow, the footpaths were too narrow. So like that is one of the learnings that they've had, and also the fact that they didn't want them being stored on the public right of way overnight. That was one of the big headaches that scooters caused and I saw that actually last time I was in Australia a couple of weeks back, scooters and bikes just sort of thrown everywhere and obstructing the sidewalk. And I thought about folks who are disabled and are in wheelchairs and having to figure out their way around some of that. And our robots, although they are operating autonomously, do have remote supervisors. So in a situation where they encounter a person in a wheelchair or a situation that needs to be handled with a little more care, the remote supervisor can direct the bot out of those instances and out of the way so that we can give right of way to the pedestrians as they should.
Ben, from the Gold Coast perspective, any learnings that you're potentially going to be sort of pulling upon for what may happen in the future with PMRs?
Yeah, and I think it's a great point and well taken. And one of the first things, as Yariel mentioned, I think their learnings in other markets, they really use those to initiate the very first of the conversations they started having with us. And so immediately coming pre-armed with some of the questions that we would have automatically had around speed and around safety, and knowing that those two elements in particular are paramount in terms of their operations, was something that I think put our policy team at ease very quickly in terms of thinking this is a very easy deployment. In terms of the type of business that we're talking about, there's plenty of precedent there in terms of the commercial operation side of things, and so those speeds that Yariel was mentioning before, somewhere between 4 and 8 kilometres, are already well below the recommended scooter and bike speeds that we're seeing now are starting to be implemented, and some laws and legislation coming in at a state level around these bikes that are supposed to be limited to 25 kilometres an hour. Some of them are doing 40, 50, 60, 70 kilometres an hour, and wanting to limit to 10 in highly dense urban areas. The fact that we're coming in at probably 50 to 80% of that speed anyway, I think automatically starts to, and once people see the size and speed that the robots operate at, that eliminates a lot of those concerns that maybe you have of a scooter that's been bought, because they're all regulated, they're all controlled by the company. You're not buying, black market products online that are capable of doing speeds well above the legislated limits. And so I think that sense of control and the fact that they will be monitored and they will be housed at a secure location overnight and all those things really made it an easy leap for us to as I said, because we want to go down that path, but we do know, and we do acknowledge that yes, there's going to be detractors, and it's not going to be everybody who's going to want to jump on board the robotics train immediately. And so us having the ability to address some of those needs even before they're raised, I think made it very easy, and it has led us down the path of wanting to move pretty quickly on this.
Yeah, great. Yariel, you've got your hand up, and then I'm going to go to the chat box as well. So yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Ben's point. I mentioned safety at the very top of our presentation because it is our top priority, not just with the speed and the 1/3000th kinetic energy that we have in comparison to cars, but also I dropped the link here in the chat for our first responder interaction plan. That is something that we launched last week and we've been working on for about a year now. It's meant to serve as a launching point for conversations with first responders all across the world. And it goes deep into what the specs are on the bot. It talks about what you can expect from it. It talks about how the operations go. There's an email for folks to reach out to us. So we're really, really excited about having launched that because our first responder community is very important to us, and they often have a lot of questions on how our robots operate and how they are to operate around them. Questions that often are similar to the questions that folks have when we engage with cities. So I'm always happy to engage in those conversations and provide as much context as possible.
Yeah, thanks, Yariel. The chat box has got some good content in here. Sang asked the question around sort of security and safety, and it is an interesting one, Sang. As much as I have tried to go searching for that original Australia Post pilot all the way back in 2017 in Brisbane, I still sort of run into sort of dead ends on what happened there. And Damith, thanks for responding there. Kirsty's got an interesting question, and I did have it on my list here to sort of bring up relating to the Brisbane 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games. Kirsty in particular has talked about sort of the looming skills and labour shortages. I think it's not looming. I think it's happening right now. And the games preparation, we've got a lot of infrastructure to build, a lot of other services that need to sort of be ready and in place. The question being, do you see that as an opportunity in engagement with government and industry, the redeployment of drivers from food and personal goods delivery to freight construction related driving? Ben, maybe starting with you with does the games factor in here at all? And then Yariel, LA28, not far away, not sure if there's any sort of parallels you can draw there, but any comments probably about the next 5 to 6 years in Southeast Queensland that we're going to experience? We're going to have material shortages, labour shortages, as Kirsty says. And then, of course, we're going to be welcoming hopefully hundreds of thousands of people. So one would think that, at least a couple of cities, if not more, in SEQ do have PMRs rolling around. So, Ben, maybe some thoughts and reactions from you first, and then Yariel.
Yeah, I would absolutely wholeheartedly agree with Kirsty's comment, and we're already starting to think about what we're going to need by the way of both employment but volunteer services during the Olympics, and as I alluded to before, what we're facing with, and it depends where you sit in the spectrum, whether it's a good or a bad problem. What we're finding is that our original sort of population areas on the Gold Coast, with the housing shortages and demand, are quickly pricing themselves out of the average house owner, renter, etc., etc. And so, like all urban areas in Australia, the sort of urban footprint is spreading further and wider. And so, getting the workforce then, because we do have light rail and we do have some network, we don't have a connected metro or subway system across the city, and so it's a real challenge for us in terms of workforce deployment and making sure we can get people to and where they're living, and that's only going to be, I think, amplified during the Olympic Games, when you start to shut down transport networks and make them exclusively available for Olympic transport, as we saw during Sydney and our own experience during the 2018 Commonwealth Games that we hosted. And so being able to deploy autonomous robots and things like that, I think it in areas where we don't want a lot of car traffic and we don't want people having to travel and transit in for work every day, I think is going to be a real benefit and something that we're looking both on the ground and in the air, in terms of way that we can keep people off the roads during those peak event times.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's great. And Yariel, LA28 on the horizon. Does it mean anything for your deployments in California?
Yeah, it definitely does. We anticipate a pickup in orders that are going to be filled, but we also anticipate something related to one of the questions in the chat, which is a disruption in our service in certain parts of town, mostly because of geofencing issues, right? There will be parts of town that are shut off because of street fairs or parades or just road closures related to games or events in specific areas. We work very closely with the city to receive that information, and the city can check where we are using MDS, because LA and Chicago and Coral Gables, soon WeHo, and several other cities are switching over to receiving our fleet management information through MDS. Again, a lesson learned from scooters, in order to verify, trust but verify, trust that we're doing it, but verify it on the back end that we are staying out of where they've said. MDS 2.1 that Andrew will talk about in your next session, I'm sure. It talks about receiving information in our direction, not just sending that information out. And that should also allow us to receive that information directly from cities very quickly whenever there are some changes in the geofence.
Okay, excellent. No, thanks for clarifying that. I want to go back onto the sidewalk for a moment, and I sort of reflect back on the week that I spent in West Hollywood and down. I don't know where it was, but Irv's Burgers was a very popular hangout for both Serve and Coco. Not that the robots were deliberately going there, they were called there. But I've got video footage of sort of up to 4 to 5 PMRs um, waiting. They all had sort of someone's name, waiting for, Steve's order is there. And there was a moment where the worker came out of the burger shop, arms full of burgers, and filled up 3. 2 of them were Serve and one was Coco, filling them up, closing the lids and on a very small street corner, sidewalk area, all 3 were kind of reversing and turning and doing a dance, and they weren't hitting each other. They were all sort of working, as they're designed, and then they sort of set off. But what was interesting is they were heading up. As they were heading up the street, it's a very narrow sidewalk there. There's lamp posts and street furniture and bins and benches. There's a couple of bars and people just sort of randomly coming out. People were just walking past and not even blinking, right? And I was sort of there, obsessed, taking video footage. I imagine that over time, and what I want to know about is the time element. When does the community get comfortable with this? Because what I was seeing is that it just blends in like it's been there for years. And so, Damith, maybe the first question for you on that is, um, where are we at with research on human robot interaction in Australia? Um, or um, is there a lot more that we need to do as it seems we start to sort of go down this pathway in Australia? Talk to me about robot human interaction on the sidewalk and where we're at with Australian lessons learned, if at all.
I mean, we are looking at adoption. So one of the key questions we ask in broader robotics space is how people adopt robots, and what makes them part of the furniture rather than a novelty. And what we've seen again and again is that Adam, is there's a bit of a peak interest. People get excited, and that's kind of where all the both the sort of, I think, the positive aspects and the negative aspects get discussed and debated, and then it becomes part of the furniture. And if it actually does serve a purpose, people tend to then accept that as something that's the norm, and we sort of just move on, I think. Um, with Australia, we really haven't seen a lot of PMR activities, or in fact, a lot of public facing robotic systems. So I think it's still a novelty factor in Australia for the most part. So I think that would be the challenge. That's where you get things contested. About a decade ago, we had a robotic art installation at the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney, and it was there for 2 years, and initially there was really a lot of interest and people talking about it in both in sort of positive and negative contexts. But was one of the poignant one was that actually when we finally shut it down after 2 years of operation, one of the security personnel at the museum came and said, "Damn it, it's really sad to see this robot leave. I think
Yeah,
we have this relationship with each other now." And this robot
yeah,
didn't have any memory or anything, right? It didn't have face recognition or anything. So I think there's that sort of adoption cycle. So there's a
mm,
bit of a hype at the beginning, and then that's where people can test. And then if the robot can show utility, I think then sort of the Australians tend to kind of acknowledge that it actually serves a purpose. So that's kind of the natural pathway for HRI, I think.
yeah, yeah. I did find myself. I'm a creature of habit, and my Airbnb in West Hollywood was around the corner from cafe. I sat there every morning at the same time, having the same breakfast and coffee. And there were moments where I've thought, oh, there goes Winona again. That's the second time I've seen Winona today because all of the Serve robots have names right on the side, and they got these blinky eyes, and they kind of suck you in, and you want to kind of give it a hug. So yeah, I suppose what I'm describing there is what you're saying is that sort of first initial kind of, yeah, this is cool, this is interesting, it's new. I'm trying to digest it. Um, a question. I'll open it for sort of any three of the panelists. Um, I've had sort of this quirky, somewhat obsession with PMRs since I saw my first one in Portland, Oregon, back in 2017. It was a Starship one, and it was nothing more than just a professional fascination. How would that actually work in a street and in the right of way? And since then, I've been sharing and posting bits and pieces, and the traction on sharing that information in Australia is not often the most popular in my LinkedIn feed. More irrelevant things seem to get more likes. My question is, um, uh, I'm trying to work out if we're ready for this in Australia. Um, Technology is never the problem, to be honest. It's more the dialogue, the regulation, the governance. I maybe we will be, and maybe that's a question for others, on the call as well. You know, we, we've got a small group online here. Is no one else interested in robots in public places in Australia, or maybe it's just a bad time of day to get them online? I don't know. I'm intrigued about how we as Australia are going to have this conversation because, of course, I'm biased. I'm keen to sort of make sure it happens. But Yariel, I know you've got your hand up. If you wanted to sort of address or respond to a little bit of that commentary from me, that'd be great as well.
Yeah, happy to. And I actually wanted to respond to your previous question as well with some anecdotal experiences that we've had. For context, in West Hollywood, we've been there now for 2 years. So, and in LA proper, we've also been there for almost as much time. So it really is part of the background. Folks almost don't even notice. In Miami, we've only been there for a year, and it's also part of the background, and folks barely notice. In Chicago, we saw a very, very, very active response from folks when we began operating, and that has declined almost as quickly as it increased when we began operating. We've been there now almost 6 months, right? So I think that's about the time, somewhere between 6 months to a year, where folks start to see it as part of the background. And that's again based on our experience in the markets that we've launched. We went from 1 or 2 large markets to now over 7 metros, and that tends to be that sweet spot where we see it.
Yeah, good. Ben, Damith, thoughts on um, Australia Inc. being able to have a good dialogue around the usefulness of this technology?
So we
What's
have
your
Ben
Yeah, I
position?
mean,
jump in quickly. Oh, sorry.
well, go ahead, Damith, after you.
Quickly, I mean, we've been kind of exploring public sort of discussion for the last, decade, and so I think there's a smaller vocal community that's really interested in robotics and being deployed. There's a larger portion of I think the society isn't really, engaged in that conversation, and they just want to see what comes next. So I think like Yariel said, I think, that sort of 1 year is a sweet spot from some of the experiments we've done. Like, people get overly excited and there's a lot of heated discussions at the beginning. Um, and then the kind of policy conversations sort of follow. Um, and then when it becomes a bit of a normal, you know, utility, people tend to sort of forget that that exists. And the only concern I think, as one of the uh, audience kind of also reflected, is I think the security aspect. Um, where if any of these robots are in sort of a critical incident, and how do we respond to that, and how sort of the media kind of pictures that and captures that, I think is an interesting question to kind of ponder. I know that these are relatively safe and and operating at slower speeds, but that sort of incidents tend to kind of then heighten the interest and also probably the kind of the negativity of deploying robots in general. So having that conversation up front and being open to those conversations, I think, is an important aspect, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Ben, you're also going to make some comments around that one?
Oh, look, I think I agree with Yariel in terms of, and again, part of the reasons why, from a city perspective, when we started the conversation with Serve, I think it's because of they did have the data points behind them. While we speak a little differently and we have a different mentality, I think at some point the law of big numbers takes over, and a city in the US is going to be the same as a city in Australia of a certain size and a certain makeup. In that, after that initial novelty period wears off, this has become more and more. And why we think we're ready for it is because, as I said at the opening, we've been a city that's traditionally embraced change. Most everybody, while we have people who have been, our First Nations inhabitants aside, people have been coming to the Gold Coast from other locations. There's always been you've lived somewhere else and you've come here and then you've made it your home. And so that in and of itself breeds, innovation and acceptance of something new coming from the outside. And so we like to almost adopt that as a badge of honor as a city. And so that gives me, I guess, personally, some confidence that we as a city would be open to this type of technology once it starts. But we won't know until we try, and so that's why we want to get there as soon as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard to really kind of fully crystallize this until you're in place with them operating. So we just need to sort of get them here in some way. Conscious of time, Lee, you've got your hand up, and Yariel, I might just get you to respond to Seng in the chat if that's okay about the 4 wheels, etc. But Lee, yes.
I really wanted to flag Ross's comment, and I'm not sure, Ross, if you wanted to mention anything more about this, or if Ben, you might want to respond about regulation. But I'm just wondering, when you say Australia tends to strangle innovation with regulation, are there municipal regulations that could be brought to bear that could help with the expediting of pilot projects and deployment? And then once you have successful use cases, it seems to be that allows for this version of the technology.
My only comment from our perspective is that what made this simple, at least in the test and pilot phase, was the fact that we were only dealing with one jurisdiction in terms of who was, so it was a city law, city policy, dealing with the mobility on the footpaths. If we were talking with driving on roads, obviously you get the state government, the departments of transport and things like that involved. And so because we had one body who was able to legislate effectively and instruct policy around this, I think it's made it a little easier, at least in the early phases.
Ross.
And look, I think this is a tremendous idea. I'm just so battle scarred by dealings with bureaucracy that, and it's a different cultural attitude that you have in the US. I think your culture there is much more embracing of innovation and change. We have a very precautionary stance to so many things here that I don't know. Maybe Adam, am I just
No,
jaded?
Ross, you're not Ross. You have many friends in the same camp. I suppose, in response, it's somewhat beneficial that we have the likes of a leader in Gold Coast and hopefully others. And I think, yeah, we just need to keep the dialogue up, I think. Yeah, but no, you're not being jaded.
The benefits of this could so easily outweigh the risks, but our tendency is to focus on the risk, mitigate the risk, control the risk, introduce geofencing. Look what happened with e-scooters. When they were first introduced, they could virtually go anywhere. Now the geofencing means that they're bloody dangerous because they'll just stop in the middle of a road. In fact, in the middle of a dedicated cycling lane. I use them a fair bit, and it's become almost unworkable because of the amount of regulation we've piled on to the whole exercise since the innovation came in. The same applies with Uber. It used to be fairly easy to be able to get an Uber, just pick up your car, download the app, and off you go, drive an Uber. Well, now the vehicle has to pass a whole bunch of motor vehicle tests and be specially licensed. And then the Uber fee, of course, has gone from, I think, started at 10%. And they now clip the ticket at about 27% of every trip taken in Australia, which I suspect is attached to the regulation that we've applied to it all. So we do it to everything. I guess that's my comment. And it's not just this particular idea. I think it's just the cultural habit we have of applying regulation to every innovation as if that's going to make it better.
Yes. No, Ross, duly noted, of course. We have high hopes and expectations, Ben. No pressure of the Gold Coast leadership certainly coming through, and I think you can hear sort of some of the somewhat small but very loud support as well for this. But friends, with that, we're a little bit over time, and I really want to respect your time, so I'm going to call that to a close. Yariel, I don't know if you're in Dallas at home, but thank you for staying up well beyond sort of normal business hours to share those insights with us. Damith, thank you for joining, and also for Ben from the URF's perspective. Stay tuned. We're going to be talking a lot more about this, and we're looking forward to your engagement and dialogue. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.